Hi, this is the Project 1 group work for EFD 620 Case Study and Data and Analysis Project. Our group members include myself, Patricia Gregory Freeman.
And I'm Adam Gooseby.
I'm Evan Hochstetler.
I'm Jennifer Stevens.
The first step asks what parts of the data catch your attention. And the part that caught my attention first was that students are struggling with the open-ended questions and short answer questions. Only 35% of students pass the open-end questions and only 56% pass short answer questions. I analyzed test questions by the type of questions we have in my own classroom, and so that stood out to me. Another thing that stood out was that there are 28 several standards being measured, and each standard, except for a couple that I'll mention in just a second, only had 1 or 2 items. There were 5 questions on linear equations, write and solve, and 5 questions on a category called SAT easy questions. There was one standard that everyone scored 100%, which was functions identity. And then the standard that had the lowest percent of students making a passing score, which was 34% of students, was systems of equations solved. And the most standout thing that stood out to me when you look at this data is all the red beside the students' names. Too many students are in the red on either all or 75% of the items. 29% of the students did not pass any items at all. And then an additional 14% only passed 25%. And the ones that they did pass were multiple choice items, which goes back to everyone had trouble with the open-ended and short answer.
So step 2 was, what does the data tell us? And the data tells us a multitude of things. It shows us that the pre-algebra skills are a strength. It shows the reviewer ways that these students could be grouped for remediation and some tier 2 and tier 3 intervention if needed. It did show us that the higher rigor questions had the lowest score, which might indicate that students need more practice with these. It shows specific areas and standards where students need more exposure in order to master that content. What the data doesn't tell us is, were these results similar in other classes? Were there any accommodations made for reading? Especially in the multi-step open-ended questions, there was a lot of reading on this test, so we don't know if there were any reading interferences or if those had been addressed prior to the test exam. The test does not show growth. We don't have a pre-test score to show any growth by, and it doesn't show us how long these students have been exposed to the material and this type of exam. This data does not tell us. We know that time was a factor in taking the test. Each section used time, but we don't know if that time played a factor in the student progress and the student scores or not. But with all of that, there is good news to celebrate. The multiple choice responses were a strength, and we know that most multiple choice tests have some sort of distractor, and so those were not a distraction for these students. The short answer distractors were also not an issue, and that there is room for growth on several of the standards based on the student responses.
All right, in step 4, we looked at problems that we could look at based on the data. First and foremost, there were far too many standards for one single assessment. I know typically in my own experience, if you test more than 2 or 3 standards on a test, kids are going to get overwhelmed. So I saw that and realized there's a lot of standards on that particular test. And then also kind of think about practices in the classroom. How often are you practicing using open-ended questions? Because if the kids are not practicing with them, they're not going to know how to respond to them. And that goes for every format of every question that's being asked. So if you test multiple choice regularly, they're going to do well on multiple choice. If you test particularly open-ended, they're going to answer well open-ended. If you go short response frequently, they're going to answer well with those. It also appears to me that there needs to be some reteaching of several standards based on the simple fact that there's some very, very low percentages for particular questions being correct. And then lastly, we need to see if one particular standard is repeatedly low scoring, especially if we're seeing it on this particular exam. Let's retest that standard again. And if the kids are continuously scoring low, then there needs to be some kind of introspection going on there as to what we can do to make sure that those kids are reaching those standards.
Okay, step 5, what are your key conclusions and recommendations? Obviously, as the group pointed out, the short and open-ended questions need work. These questions show whether the students know the material or they do not know it. So it's leave a lot of room for the students to give their thought process and answer questions that are not multiple choice. Students did score higher on multiple choice questions throughout the test. And obviously throughout all standards, the test does not show mastery. The students did well on the DOK1 questions, but how often in the classroom are they working on higher DOK questions? This needs to be addressed in the classroom. Students need to practice the DOK3s and higher questions to do better on the summative assessment. Remediation is needed for students that score low on standards, and in the classroom, continuous formative assessments need to check understanding on low scoring standards.
That concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening to our analysis of the data.